Welcome back, everybody. I'm very excited to be speaking again with Laurent Guyenot. Last time we had a really good talk, and I had people who were messaging me and saying, "Whoa, that was really something. That was really interesting." And in my circles, I don't know if I've told you this, Laurent, but even in like the people I talk to, they kind of think I'm kind of out there in all the sort of crazy conspiracy theories that I believe in. And one of the ones that I've been believing in for years now, and that I've been always eager to learn more about and to read more about, is the idea of historical revisionism. This idea that maybe we don't actually understand history all that well, or at least
Mhm.
everything past a certain date is very murky.
Mhm.
And I don't know, this offends a lot of people, including a lot of people who we might consider to be patriotic or right wing, because these people are interested, I think, in history, or they're interested in their religion, right? And if you get into historical revisionism and you're like, well, what if this didn't happen? What if Charlemagne wasn't, real? What if what if this Roman history that we think we know isn't real? What if this didn't exist? This didn't happen? This religious figure was made up. People, this I didn't, I don't know why. I really like this sort of thing. I never got offended. I always thought this is the greatest thing ever. I really enjoyed it. But people
Mhm.
really, really resist this. Have you found that like and we're going to get into historical revision and what it is and what it is. But have you found that you've got a lot of
Oh,
resistance to it? I was just reading the comments section, and people were like, "What is this? How dare he?" What do you make of that, Laurent?
yeah. Well, yeah, of course, I know what you're talking about. And actually, especially in France, when you get into revisionism about the Middle Ages and the Crusades, for example, which is really the core of the 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 history of the Middle Age, the Crusades really at the heart of it. And the Crusades very much a French adventure. It started with the French and it somehow ended with the French. Of course, the German, the British were involved. But then when you touch on the Crusades and on many things about the Middle Age, yes, of course, you touch a very sensitive chord among people who love France, for example. I'm talking from France, so I'm mentioning France, but it's the same from other countries. But I think particularly France, because what is France? What is a nation really? It's a national narrative in many ways. When you say you love France, you mean you love the history of France. You love the history of the kings of France, and it's a narrative. So when you touch that narrative, it seems like you're touching, you're wounding the heart of the nation. Because when you ask what is France, for example, and most people think, well, France was founded by that goes back to Clovis, or they have all these foundational figures, mythical figures who made France. But when you look more precisely, you realize it's not true. Clovis, was not French. He was a Frank. He didn't care about France. He never conquered France. As we have this picture of France as a geographical entity. In fact, this geographical entity, if you dig beyond the narrative, beyond the school book narrative, then you realize this uh, administrative and geographical entity did not really exist before, let's say, the 14th century or something like this. So yeah, revisionism is something, but it's fascinating too. Like you, I feel it's fascinating, and it's not that depressing. I feel, when you go beyond a certain stage, I thought it's like when I think about France, for example, or Europe in a sense, you have a sense today that we're dying, right? So when somebody's dying, it's a good time to look back at your life and analyze what you did wrong, what in your life, made you take that choice rather than another one, and pushed you in that direction rather than in another direction. You have to look back at your life when you're at the end of your life. It's just a natural thing to do. So I feel from the point of view of Europe today, this is the thing to do. Look back, You know, where are we today? We are in a terrible situation. We're dying, so it's a good time to really look back and overcome, you know, your childish, you know, self image, and really dig down and look what led you to this. So what fascinates me is to understand, to see that there are some kind of long trajectories. You know, the way the place we are today is the result of a very long history. And if you only look at the narrative, you cannot understand why we are at this stage today. You have to look at the reality. You have to find out, you know, beyond yourself justification, and you know, you have to overcome you know, all the mistakes and sins or crimes you have repressed into your unconscious. You have to dig down and look, you know, with courage and look at it and see what you did wrong. So Europe, a lot of things went wrong. So, you know, it's necessary to look clearly. And it's not that depressing, as I was saying, because we are entering a new world. We're seeing a new world order or disorder or whatever, something coming up. So something will come up out of it. Just you have to know who you are as a nation or as Europe. You have to know who you are in order to find your place in that new world. If you continue to play, you know, to act some role which does not correspond to you, who you really are, you will not find your place. You will be pushed aside and laughed at, you know. So it's, you know, for all this reason, I don't feel guilty, or I feel on the contrary, I'm, you know, taking responsibility to call French Catholics nationalists, to tell them, hey, look, you know, look at the reality. Stop, you know, repeating your own, your eternal self-aggrandizing stories. You know, look who you are, and accept that where you are today is a result of history which is not as you think it is. These kind of things.
Yeah, well, to just narrow in, I think we have to start with the Dark Ages. And in French history, I have to say, like, or just European history, uh, I think in terms of like these bad narratives, the Dark Ages is probably one of the worst narratives. It's this idea that, like, you know, Europeans were these barbarous, like, you know, these savages basically that because they invaded or something, they destroyed this empire, and the light was extinguished for like almost 1,000 years. And because of that, we were set back for so long. And then we had a renaissance, and then things started to get better. That's basically the narrative. It's funny because that's I mean, that's what they say in the West, and that's not very flattering of themselves, right? But apparently Russians or Slavs didn't even exist, because we suddenly appear in the scene about 1,000 years ago from now. And before that, apparently we didn't exist. And then there's this weird explanation they give for where Slavs come from, and they say there's a French word called esclave, which means slave, and that's the origin of the word Slav. And it's like, why are we calling ourselves by a French or an English name? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas in the Slavic languages, Slav means, like, you know, glory or honor, or Slav, which means the word. So anyway, but so yeah, from the east of Europe and the west of Europe, and frankly south, where Islam arose, we have this mysterious millennium that we don't seem to really understand. I mean, if we actually look at the details, it's hard to make sense of it all. So is that where we have to start with the Dark Ages? And so I would divide it into three parts. I would say that there's the Western Dark Ages, the narrative. There's the Eastern Dark Age narrative, which is probably the most empty, like probably the most mysterious. There's nothing happening, apparently. There's entire nations that just spring up out of the ground in about 1,000 AD. And then in the south, there's also this weird gap that occurs. So maybe we should start with the West, because that's where you started as well. What do you make
Okay.
of the Dark Ages and the role in Western historical revisionism?
Well, you know, as you know, I wrote a few articles originally on the Unz Review. Originally, I didn't sign them by my name. I signed them the first Millennium Revisionist. Then recently I published them and revised them and published them under my name, under the title Anno Domini. And this was the result of a slow realization that I had over the years after I completed my PhD on medieval history, and after I, studied 9/11 and so on, and started to realize that history is just a big lie. And so, those two things started to interact, and then I started to look at the Middle Age in a different way. And I started to realize that the Dark Ages, or the first millennium, is actually incredibly dark, and all those stories about it are very suspicious for different reasons. The major reason, of course, being that we don't have any contemporary source. All we have is stories, copied in the second millennium, and sometimes even lost or and discovered during the Renaissance. And so the first thing that I started to really realize is that most historians are incredibly naive, in my sense, when they study their sources. And the paradox actually is that when historians have very few sources, let's take, for example, the story of Charlemagne or the story of Clovis, or, there are very, very few sources. And when they have sometimes one source, one narrative, one biography, or one book from the Middle Ages, then they have no choice but either to paraphrase it. If you're a historian, you want to write about Charlemagne, and you have only one biography of Charlemagne. Or we could do this. We could say the same about Constantine the Great too. Actually, you have only Eusebius's biography. Then what do? Either you trust it, and then you just repeat what's in the book, or you have nothing to say because you have no other source. So there is a paradox that the less source historians have, the more they trust them, which is paradoxical. And when they have many sources, then they're a bit embarrassed because they have to say, well, they contradict, the sources contradict each other. So what do we do? So they have things to discuss. So when you look at the Dark Ages,
jump in?
Yeah.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
So with the Charlemagne example, just to broadly outline some stuff. So when we're looking at problems with chronology, there's several things that we look for. Like, for example, duplication. Is the story of Charles Martel somewhat similar to the story of Charlemagne? Is it possible that it's a duplicate? You have that a lot in Eastern Europe, and you have that a lot in is it possible that so that's one of the interesting things, is that history might get duplicated. And this is one of the theories that was presented by Fomenko, and he brought examples of several historical figures that were separated by like 200 or 300 years. And his method was really interesting. It's like he had a scatter plot, and he basically plotted out using keywords, sort of just like the incidence of words and events, and he sort of created like a mathematical representation of the life story of this person, right? And so, for example, if he did it with like many different keywords, I guess you could say. So if he chose just the name of, say, a king, like King Alaric or something, and then he plotted how many times it was mentioned or whatever. Well, the point is that using his graphs and using his keyword analysis and that sort of thing, he realized that like a lot of stories seem to be duplicates because they follow the same structure, because there's the strange aligning of these keywords, and it looks actually like a key like a little key. If you look at the scatter plots that he shows as his examples, it looks like a key that you put into the door with the little teeth, and that's sort of like the graph with the little spikes going up and down. And the point is that if you can compare the life story using the analysis of keywords of one historical figure with another one, and the keys match, like the ridges, the up and downs, they're kind of similar. So it's a really innovative method because he was a mathematic. Then, so that's one thing we have is duplicates that we look for that say, maybe this person didn't exist, or maybe something was inaccurate about this because it's too similar to something that came later or came before. Then another interesting issue that comes up in chronology is like the what you said, the complete lack of any actual evidence in some cases. Like all we have is either religious sources, and Eusebius is a good example because he says, I'm not a historian. He says, I'm a propagandist. Like what I'm doing, I'm not a historian. I am here to push a religious narrative. And he did. And the story of Constantine is very strange that we get from him. And right, so and people I think don't understand just how that, like you said, I mean it's shocking. There's like literally nothing from before 1000 AD, nothing at all except for some architecture, right? And we can't date the architecture unless we have some other orientation. Like how are we supposed to know when this building was, right? We have to, or it has to be relative to other things. We have to orient ourselves, right? Or dendrochronology or sediment layers, right? So it's incredible actually when everyone thinks everything's figured out, but if you actually just look at the evidence, what text do we have from the 5th century, the 6th century, the 7th century? What documents do we have from there? What accounts, what statues, what art? And the answer is nothing. It's shocking. It's so that's two things. Do you want to comment on that? That they both relate to Charlemagne because there's absolutely nothing that we have on this guy that's contemporaneous at all, and it seems like he's a duplicate. So what do you think?
Well, what do I think? I on Fomenko, I would say, of course, I read almost all his books translated in English. There are quite a lot of them, about 10 volumes, I think. I think he brings a lot of good points. He points to a lot of weaknesses in the common narrative, but the criticism that historians voice against him is that you cannot just reduce history to mathematics. So I think his method, I came to realize, is interesting, but is not as decisive evidence as he thinks. And the other problem with Fomenko is that he really overdoes it, in his revision of chronology. So maybe for those who don't know, I would like to say a word about what is, what we call in France, we call it recentism, because it's the theory that some things are more recent than what we believe. And it's a matter of revising the chronology. But in the case of Fomenko, he doesn't only revise the chronology of the 1st century, but even of the 1st millennium, but also the 2nd millennium up to the 16th century, I think. So he goes too far, and it's very difficult to follow him that far. But he built a foundation. He was one of the earliest. Then there is another school in the German school, they published a few articles in English, but not so much, mostly in German. And they have a more modest approach, and they focused on Charlemagne, and they realized Charlemagne's there's a whole bunch of problems with Charlemagne, particularly with archaeology and architecture. The remains of his reign, his capital as Aachen and his palace as Ingelheim just don't fit what, it's not what it should be. So Ingelheim looked like a Roman building of the 2nd century AD, and Aachen has architecture technology, which is 2 centuries in advance. So, and there are other things connected to the Latin of Charlemagne's time, which is absolutely identical to the Latin of the Roman Empire of the 2nd century AD and so on. So then they have a more modest approach, and they say that they claim that the first millennium is 300 years too long. In fact, from Christ, let's say from the birth of Christ, whatever that means, until let's say the year 1000. In fact, there are 200 years too many. And then there are other schools, and I try to bring my own viewpoint into that. I try to add some different arguments, different perspective, focusing on the rivalry between Rome and Constantinople. But one thing I want to say is that when you look at the Dark Age, you see a lot of problems. You see a lot of things that are not right, that you have to get into revisionism. Things did not happen the way they are told. And that's the reason is very simple, is that history is written by the victors. And so, the victors are generally the aggressor, but they want to pretend they have been aggressed and all these kind of things, we know. So during the first millennium, especially in the West, the church, had a tremendous power to write history, with no competitor. So they just wrote what they wanted to write. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that the chronology is wrong, but then you realize that where did this chronology come from? And then you realize that, well, actually, we didn't start counting years in Anno Domini, since the beginning of the 2nd millennium. So how do we know, if the chronology is correct during the 1st millennium? Because no chronicle had a consistent and clear chronology. Every chronicle, with the few chronicles we have, because we have very few sources, from the 1st millennium, and all those chronicles or annals that just dated events based on, this king's reign or local events. So then you realize how this chronology was built, and then you realize, well, it didn't happen before the beginning of the 2nd millennium, and in fact, it became the world chronology. The connecting all the chronology of Western Europe, of Eastern, the Middle East, and China, and so on. That was even much later. That was done in the 16th or 17th century. And there again, there are all kinds of mistakes, because, how do you connect the chronology of China or India, for that matter? Because in India, we have absolutely no way to date anything, before the 1st millennium, at least. So, there was a lot of guesswork in doing that, but it became standard, it became established. And curiously, most historians never question their chronology. You hardly ever read a historian questioning the chronology, because the chronology is the backbone of history. So, that's not their job. They assume the chronology is correct, and then they try to see what happened at that date, but they never wonder if this really happened at that date or maybe 2 centuries earlier. They don't do this. It's considered, it's radical. But it's interesting. It's fascinating. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I have no final conclusion. I have to admit, I could not reach any definite correct chronology. Just I realized, it's a mess, and and surely there are a lot of things wrong.
Yeah, well, that's what I like about your work, is that you've looked at like all these different schools. You looked at Gunnar, right? I can't pronounce these Germans.
Gunnar
right?
Heinsohn, yeah, Gunnar Heinsohn. He's a
Heinsohn,
German,
right?
Yeah. He
You've
goes.
Looked at him. You've looked at.
Yeah. Gunnar Heinsohn, if I may say a word about him, he comes from the German school that I mentioned, but he goes further and he takes away 7 centuries away from the 1st millennium. So what he says is that basically the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, connect directly to the beginning of the 2nd millennium. So there was no late antiquity, there was no early Middle Ages. You go straight from antiquity, imperial antiquity, to the Middle Ages, to the high Middle Ages, the 11th or 10th,
Right. So
10th
there's
century.
that's Heinsohn. So he's minus 700. Then you have Illig, right? And Illig is subtract about 300, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then recently
And
I
then
found that
Fomenko
Fomenko is in completely
minus
different league.
1,000.
Yeah. Recently I found, of course, one objection to that. One objection to this is that, well, don't we have scientific ways of dating things today, like radiocarbon and carbon 14, and dendrochronology and so on. So recently I wrote an article, I'll publish it soon, to answer that objection. And I came across two scientists who did a lot of work on dendrochronology, and they conclude that, there's a lot of things wrong in the standard dendrochronological record. And they also come up to the conclusion that there's about 250 years too many in the first millennium. So even from the point of view of scientific dating, if you look closely, you realize that they assume the chronology is right, and they manage to force their data into the standard chronology rather than testing the standard chronology by their different method. It's quite clear.
Right. So we have Fomenko, who says, forget the whole first millennium. He was sort of a pioneer. He was ahead of everybody, and then he inspired.
Sure.
And then you have minus Heinsohn, who was minus 700. And then we have Illig, who's around, I think it's minus 300. And it's like the three big ones that I know. Are there any ones that I'm missing with some very unique takes? Or is that about summarizes the
that
field?
Summarizes, yes, that's it. There's a Russian school and a German school. The French are just following the Germans. I'm not aware of any other school on working on chronology. But as I said, from my viewpoint, I became very interested in that, but I came to the conclusion that it's not the right approach to directly try to fix the chronology. First, you have to undo, kind of how do you say, pull the thread of all the errors that you find, and then in the end, maybe you will discover the chronology finally is wrong, and if you shorten the chronology, maybe things start to make sense, right? But I realize, you have to, because you have to understand what happened. Who wrote history and why. And that's where I came with a strong sense that one major factor in the distortion of the first millennium history was the competition between Rome and Constantinople. And this, to me, explains a lot of things, because you quickly understand that Rome had tremendous power to write history. And we know they forged so many documents. The most famous one is the donation of Constantine, which had an incredible influence on European history throughout even the second millennium up to the 16th century. The false donation of Constantine is a forgery, by the popes, but we know of many other, hundreds of other forgeries. So they forged history. They are the main. There are two, in my view, there are two major origin of the distortions of European history. One is the papacy from the 10th century, or even started before, but mostly from the 10th and 11th century. And the second one is during the Renaissance, when the Roman and Italian humanists imagined, made up a fanciful image of the Roman Empire, and wrote, hundreds of forged history of Rome, you know, and so that's those two. Our history is really founded on those two big enterprise of forgery.
Right. So we have a situation where it seems like possibly the entire history of the Western Roman Empire, and by extension our knowledge of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, might be totally made up, because we just have. Well, I think we need to start with Petrarch, and Petrarch is this known forger. Like, that was his job, was it not? He was known for being good at that sort of thing and making money doing that. And all of a sudden, he goes to Rome, and even in I think it's like his biography, or his diary, he's writing, or yeah, like he wrote like an autobiography. I think it was revolutionary at the time, apparently. And he writes that he gets to Rome and he was expecting to see all these wonders there. And what he found was just like a medieval town that was rather poor. And he didn't, and he writes that he didn't find any of that stuff that he was looking for. But then later on, he does seem to find all these hidden texts, all these hidden interesting stories, right? And a lot of our history of Rome is, again, it's copies of something. And even if we are to believe in the official history, we're supposed to believe that for 1,000 years, these monks are copying pagan texts that they do not agree with, that they're supposed to be burning, right? But for some reason, these monks have this like great love for the pre-Christian world, and so they're actually making copies of a select few of these pagan texts. And that's why we still, have these texts, because they would rot away or be destroyed within like 100 or 200 years if it wasn't periodically updated. So what do we make out of all this? Is Petrarch, am I on the right track here? The monks, Petrarch, maybe if a totally fake, made up Western history of Western Rome. What do you think? What do you make of all this?
Well, yeah, Petrarch is definitely one person worth focusing on to understand what was going on in the 14th century. Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1374. And it's interesting to read in one book by Jerry Bruton called The Renaissance Bazaar. It's a very interesting book about all those Renaissance humanists, who they really were and what they were up to. And he talks a lot about Petrarch, and he doesn't at all doubt any of the authenticities of the works discovered by Petrarch, including many letters of Cicero. And but the way he writes makes it sound almost involuntarily ironical, when he says, I quote, "Cicero was crucial to Petrarch and the subsequent development of humanism because he offered a new way of thinking about how the cultured individual united the philosophical and contemplative side of life with its more active and public dimension. This was the blueprint for Petrarch humanism." So in fact, Petrarch's humanism is so much identical to Cicero's humanism that it's hard to make a difference. Even Petrarch wrote letters, his own letters, in the style of Cicero. And so Petrarch discovered, those letters of Cicero. But in my view, there are strong reasons to suspect that he actually forged much of what he supposedly discovered. And if Petrarch was alone, of course, the suspicion would not be so strong. But you look at all kinds of other individuals from the 14th and 15th century, and some of them are actually demonstratingly forgers. And one of them was the most famous one is Poggio Bracciolini. He lived a little bit later than Petrarch, and he was a known forger, and he discovered the manuscript of Tacitus. And Petrarch, by the way, discovered the manuscript of who that? Yeah, Titus Livy. Titus Livy. You know, when you study the history of the Roman Empire, you don't have that many sources. You have Tacitus, you have Titus Livy, and then you have a few other sources. Some of them already known to be very suspicious. You know, so if you start to suspect that Tacitus, discovered by Poggio Brazzolini in very suspicious circumstances, and Titus Livy, discovered by Petrarch, if you suspect those two sources to be forgeries, then you are left with almost nothing about the Roman Empire. And so, and then you realize, well, there are many reasons why those Florentine or Roman intellectuals would forge the history of the Roman Empire, that they were building up. You know, at that time, you have to understand that Italy was basically a bunch of city-states in constant competition with each other. There was no, of course, there was a, you know, sometimes it was part of northern Italy was part of the Germanic Empire, and so and southern Italy was what we call the Kingdom of Sicily. But basically, all those cities in northern Italy were basically trying to keep their independence, and they founded themselves as commune, you know, independent, administrative and fiscally free entities. And so they were competing also between each other, and a very important basis for power at that time was ancientness, you know, antiquity. The older you are, the more prestige you have, and the more claim you can have to precedence over, you know, all other cities, for example. So everybody was playing the same game, inventing antique stories about their own history. You know, everybody was doing it. Even the northern cities were claiming to have been founded by, you know, the son of Abraham or whoever. You know, they were picking up ancestors in the Bible or in the Homeric.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt,
stories.
but didn't the original Crusaders like Dagobah, didn't they claim that they were from this hidden Davidic line
Sure.
that had somehow ended up, and that was the justification for the Crusades, was it not? That they were this the tribe of they were the hidden line of David, and they were reclaiming their Israeli kingdom, as it said in the Bible, and that was actually like the justification, I think, for the Crusades, right? So that's
Well,
just, it's funny, but like
I
it's
don't
these
think.
people cared about.
Well, I don't think the Capetians or even the Carolingians kings claim to be genetically descended from David. They used, you know, the Davidic pattern to claim to be the new David. Or the new Moses or whatever, you know, but I don't think they, you know, of course, the coronation ceremony in France was borrowed from the Bible, you know, with the holy oil, and the king was anointed in the style of David. But I don't think, no, what they did claim, pretty much like everybody, was ancestry from Troy. You know, everybody is trying to find some ancestor from Troy. The British, Brutus was said to be from Troy. All kinds of people were trying to find some origin in the Orient, which is interesting in itself. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that Rome had a strong motivation to invent itself as the center of the world, of a highly civilized, and the inventor also of the Republic, at a time when actually Rome was trying to found itself as a republic in the 11th or 12th century, actually. 11th, 12th century. Rome was founded at that time, founded itself, and kicked out the Pope, by the way. You know, a few times the Pope was kicked out of Rome because the Romans, the people living in Rome, the citizens of Rome, wanted to be an independent city, and they didn't want to be ruled by the Pope. So at that time, that was the time of Petrarch. Well, the time of Petrarch was a little bit after, actually. The time of Petrarch was the time when the Pope finally left for Avignon. You know, that was the papacy in Avignon.
Babylonian captivity.
Yeah. So at
Yeah.
that time, Rome started to fall apart economically because they had at that time actually they had an incentive to bring back the papacy to Rome because the papacy in Rome brought a lot of money, a lot of economic activity, pilgrims and all kinds of things. And so anyway, there was a Petrarch was a politician. He was a politician. He was not primarily, so he was a politician and a propagandist. He's remembered today as a humanist who revived Cicero, but that was not his main activity in life. He wanted to restore the greatness of Rome. And so to restore the greatness of Rome, he invented the past greatness of Rome. I cannot prove that, now by just on this radio show, but in my book, in my articles, I have gathered a lot of evidence that much, not all, but much of the history of the Roman Empire is fake. And one, besides the literary, literature, one strong argument in favor of that is architecture, because there is something very strange that has been noted by archaeologists and historians already for 2 or 3 centuries, is that when you go to Rome, it's very difficult to find anything medieval in Rome. It's all either antique or Renaissance. So where is medieval Rome? Of course, you have churches here and there, because churches cannot be dated to the Roman Empire. They were not supposed to be churches. But basically, there is a big enigma of the architecture in Rome. And the enigma is easily solved if you think, and that's where you end up with a chronological revisionism, is that if you take away the Middle Age, then antiquity, imperial antiquity connects directly to, well, if you take up the early Middle Age and late antiquity, then you find again, you restore a continuity in architecture. There is no void, no vacuum. Whereas in the conventional chronology, there is a huge vacuum of architecture in Rome, and you have another huge vacuum of architecture in almost every Italian city. And even in Avignon you have medieval architecture, but you have no antique architecture. So wherever you go, you're missing something. So either you're supposed to be in a medieval city, but it's supposed to have existed already in antiquity, but there is nothing left from antiquity, or you find yourself in Rome, for example, a city which somehow mysteriously left almost nothing from the Middle Age. So that's another very strong argument for thinking that there are some phantom centuries in our chronology.
So, well, with the architecture, it's pretty, and you eat your pizza, and that's what the women care about, and that's all we're gonna we're gonna be allowed to think about in polite company. As long as it's pretty, who cares if it's medieval, right? But
Yeah.
so how fake are we talking here? Are we talking about like, because there's several ways to interpret the fact that Roman history is fake. Are you saying that option A, that there was this Rome, and we basically got most of it right, with these very what do you call it, iconic legionnaires outfits, the armor that we all know about, and this republic, and all these battles between Caesar and the Gauls and the Senate, and then his son Octavian. I use like that all happened. It's just we don't have any, maybe our account of it is just not fully understood. Or option B, that didn't happen at all. It's all made up. Or perhaps it's stories about stuff that was happening in Italy, and like in like actual Renaissance Italy, first millennium Italy, and it was then pretended that it was some sort of a duplicate type scenario.
Yeah,
Or the
exactly.
third one, which sort of ties into perhaps your latest, perhaps where these events did take place, but they didn't take place in Italy. Maybe some of the stuff was happening, but it was in Rome, that is Eastern Rome, that is where the people up until the 19th century, until the 20th century, excuse me, were calling themselves Romans on the census and not Greeks. Is it possible that, is it possible
Yeah.
that all this stuff was happening, except it was happening closer to it was all in the eastern half, and then the western half said actually all that history it's ours and not yours. Is kind of what do you like? Explain how fake you mean? And I had another yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you summarized very well the three possibilities actually, and I'm not sure which is the, but I think it's a bit of the three. I'm not sure how much of the Roman Empire really existed. I suppose I'm not sure. So, but what I'm quite sure of is that it was not the way we imagine it. How do we imagine the Roman Empire? Well, pretty much, you go and see Ridley Scott's film Gladiator. And there you have the Roman Empire, right? And you have all these tremendous Renaissance style buildings in Rome. And you have this beautiful bust, of all those Greek philosophers. You have this incredible technology of sculpture, And then all this is supposed to have disappeared in the 4th or 5th century. When you have all these barbarians who come to Europe, they love the Roman Empire. They didn't hate it. They didn't want to destroy it. They wanted to become Roman. And they adopted Latin as the language. The Franks adopted Latin. But somehow they were unable to even find a sculpture to make their own portrait. So how did this tremendous Roman technology in art, if we take art because it's visual, we can visualize it so people can see, the problem visually, you go and see Gladiator, I think it's a good example, and you see the level of technology, even in the weapons, in the weapons and everything, military technology, architecture, sculpture, clothes, everything. That disappeared. That's supposed to have totally disappeared. Nothing approaches it until the Renaissance. Throughout the Middle Ages, you find nothing comparable in terms of technology. So that's, for me, a strong reason to believe that at least I'm quite sure the Roman Empire surely did not look like that at all. That's just not possible. There are also problems of technology in terms of for example, very few people know that the Romans built with concrete. They had invented very strong, very resistant, even watertight concrete. That's how they build their, you need to have some watertight concrete to build all these aqueducts. And, to build those, how do you call it in French, coupole, on top of the Pantheon in Rome, You have a huge roof, this semi-spherical roof. It's made of concrete, In the Middle Age, people didn't have concrete. They had no idea what concrete even existed. So, there's so many reasons to really strongly doubt that many things that we think as Roman did not exist, let's say in 2,000 years ago. That's one thing. But another thing which to me became very important is to really understand, as you said, that much of that Rome invented itself in the early second millennium, end of first millennium, beginning of second millennium AD, because they wanted to steal the birthright, let's put it this way, of Constantinople. And there are two possibilities. Either, in fact, Constantinople was founded earlier than the Italian Rome. That's a possibility. I'm not sure. Honestly, I could not really come to a clear conclusion. Or at least Rome was much smaller than it claims to have been, and the real center of the world was Constantinople, and that's a fact. That Constantinople from the 4th century became the center of the Mediterranean world and even the Eurasian world in a sense. And what I realized as a medievalist is that it's really incredible that you can study the Middle Age in Western Europe and hardly ever hear about Byzantium or Constantinople, whereas in fact, it was really the center of the world, economically, culturally. And even if you dig a little bit, you realize that Romans from Rome, Italy, themselves considered that they came from the east. They came from Troy, or they had all kinds of those stories, and genetically today and linguistically today also, different studies tend to confirm that the founders of Rome, the Etruscans basically came from the east, came from Greece, the Balkans, or Asia Minor. We were not sure, anyway, it's in the east somewhere. So there is a very, very strange situation that the Romans, in their own mythology, in their own story, they recognize themselves as coming from the east, but they also claimed that the people of Constantinople, who called themselves Romans, were originally coming from the west. And there is always this kind. If you study the history of Europe or the Mediterranean world, you have kind of a back and forth shift, civilizational shift between Western Europe, Rome, Italy, and Constantinople and the East. So it's if you try to make sense of the Romans, originally coming from the east to settle in Rome, Italy, and then after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, going back to the east to found Constantinople, there's something wrong here. So I've been trying to make sense of that, and I think I have understood that our whole narrative is based on an attempt of Western, the Roman papacy, basically, the Roman papacy in its competition with, in its attempt to claim precedence and superiority over Constantinople, have been both trying to erase Constantinople from the map and from history, and steal its place in world history. In fact, we know that much of the Renaissance, was based on the theft of Byzantine culture, technology, art, literature. This has been demonstrated now very clearly. There would have been no one Byzantine specialist whom I mentioned in my latest article, Anthony Caldelis, makes it very clear that there could never have been a Renaissance in Constantinople, for one simple reason, is that in Constantinople they never lost touch with the ancient Greek culture, history, philosophy, whereas that had completely disappeared from the West. And so when they rediscovered it after plundering Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade, then they had a Renaissance. It was not a Renaissance, it was a theft, basically.
So you're leaning towards some of the stuff to do, like Rome existed, except it existed in the East. Italy was just a colony of the Eastern core, which was situated in Constantinople, right? And so some of the stories possibly could have been real people, but they were transplanted to the seat of the papacy instead of being in Constantinople where they rightly belong. So perhaps there's some stuff about Rome that we can say and that we do know. It's just the location has been displaced. That's one theory. And then what do you make of the whole Romanian riddle? Here you have slightly north of a Greek-speaking part, you have the people who have the cleanest Roman dialect that has that has continued on to this day. A lot of Romanian revisionists claim that they are the Romans, that in fact Rome was based in like Romania, or it started from Romania. And the only other explanation we have is that there were these veterans who were resettled in Romania, and for some reason that's the only Roman colony in the world that sort of really preserved its Roman ness somehow, despite all the stuff that happened subsequently. But there's also weird stuff like how if we consider history up to that point, we had the Greeks being the dominant power, and then a little bit north of them, Macedon races up, and then is it possible that a little bit north of them, it was the Romans coming down? And we know that actually, in terms of Roman ruins, there's not so many in Italy as compared to Romania, which is absolutely filled with amphitheaters. There's there's so many Roman ruins. There's more of those Colosseum type structures in Romania than there are in Italy. So I don't know. That's kind of a crazy one. But what do you make of the Romanian hypothesis that basically a lot of this stuff
Well,
happened, but it
yeah.
happened in the wrong place in general?
Yeah, well, I think the linguistic, especially also aspect of Romanian riddle is very interesting because it's really a clear case where the standard narrative does not make sense at all. It's just impossible. And because, if you find a few things in the narrative that are just impossible, then the narrative itself is impossible, And so in that case, it's quite clear because the standard narrative, as you said, is that, well, a few Roman legions settled for a couple of centuries, not more, in South Dacia. The place was called in Roman literature Dacia, but they settled only in the south of Dacia under the Danube River. Okay, and these legions were not even Italian, because Roman legions, in the east were not Italians generally. But still, they are supposed to have imposed their Latin language on the Dacians, even though in the north of Dacia there was no Roman legion, but still people started to speak Latin. Roman legion are supposed to have spoken some kind of we don't know where they were from, but surely they were not Romans from Italy. Okay, and even if they were not speaking Latin. They were speaking some kind of vulgar military Latin. We don't know, but the Dacians are supposed to have given up their language. What was their language? We have no idea. Nobody knows. It has left absolutely no trace. So the Dacians are supposed to have abandoned their language, adopted Latin. Nobody knows how or why, but still later they were invaded by all kinds of people. They were invaded by the Huns, by the Hungarians, I think, by Germans, by Slavs. But still today they continue to they hanged up to their Latin language. That just doesn't make any sense. And the Romanian language happens to be the closest language to Latin. So, we need an alternative narrative to explain that. It's not possible. So, as you said, there is an alternative explanation, which is, I think, getting ground in Romanian universities, that actually the Romanians were the original Romans. Latin is actually coming from there rather than the opposite. Latin is an administrative language, an artificial language. That's another thing which is particular to Latin. Latin cannot have been a language, it's not a natural language. It's an administrative and military language, but the roots are coming from the East. In fact, Rome itself, I think that's a strong point to make. Rome itself is a Greek word, So Romans, I'm quite convinced that I don't know exactly the whole scenario, how it really happened in the chronology, whether Constantinople is actually older than Rome. In fact, I'm not sure about that. That's a possibility. But one thing I'm sure of is that the term Roman, the Romans were from the East before they came to Italy. Their name is Greek, their mythology is Greek. It's quite well known that the Romans of Italy, they have no mythology of their own. Why not? Well, because they came from Greece. They brought their mythology from Greece. So the linguistic enigma is not, I don't have the complete clue, because Latin became the language of Italy, but it stopped being the language of Constantinople in the 6th century after Justinian. So we don't know exactly At what time
Well,
precisely?
I mean, isn't Latin just entirely a made-up language? Yeah,
Yes.
because it was decided it was used by the church because I mean we have like Tertullian basically saying we have to make war on everything Greek. We have to defeat Greece, and so we're going to have to use Latin here.
Hmm.
And you see Latin really only starting. I mean, it seems to be like a church, like they made up a language.
Yeah, that's
Is
a
that like
possibility.
too?
Yeah. That's a
Um,
possibility, but then that would mean that all these ancient Latin chronicles like Titus Livy and Tacitus, and there's quite a bunch of them, was made up in the second millennium. If there was no Latin, then nobody wrote
well,
Latin
not that
before.
kind of,
Uh,
not like
yeah,
church. Well, I don't
yeah,
know. I mean, that
yeah.
there's just another mystery. I don't really understand it
But
either.
definitely
What do you
there are
make of?
Yeah, there are quite a few books showing quite convincingly, in my view, that Latin, as we know it, was an artificial language. There are some characteristics in Latin that are completely different from all natural languages which evolved. There are no exceptions in Latin. Everything is straight. Everything is absolutely. And it's even I read somewhere that Latin is a perfect language for lawyers. It's a language for law, and for it's not a language for compared to Greek. It has no subtlety, even for theology. Even that's why there is a big difference between Orthodox theology and Latin theology. So Latin, yes, I think there's a strong argument that it is an artificial language.
Yeah, but probably based off the precursor like Romanian, I guess
Yeah,
you
yeah,
could say.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. So okay, but have you heard this? So how fake is Caesar then, Julius Caesar? And I bring this up because I swear when I got really into Caesar and I was reading all about his Gallic campaigns and all his adventures, and I was always struck by these weird battles that he was having, where
Mm-hmm.
he's always digging these trench lines and he's like using these huge. It's like he's assaulting these massive cities. He's building all these huge siege engines,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to like in my mind understand why does he need like to build trench lines all the time? Why is he constantly building fortifications? It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like he's in World War One or like he's in a trench, like a gunpowder age. Why do you need this sort of thing if you're fighting with bits of metal? Basically like medieval style warfare. Like it seems like it, I don't know. But then the crazy thing is that I checked with these like conspiracy theorists, and it turns out I wasn't the only one who had thought that up. People had
Mm-hmm.
listened to these accounts of Caesar's battles, and they were like, how could this possibly be a battle being fought with people armed with sharp sticks and sharp pieces of metal? This sounds like this is somebody who's fighting with at least muskets or something. So,
Yeah.
and then there are these paintings that from like the 14th, I guess, and 15th centuries, where it's supposed to be depicting Caesar's battles and especially the Gallic campaign,
Mm-hmm.
and of course everyone in it is depicted as if they are fighting with gunpowder in knightly metal and that sort of thing. And historians, there's actually a lot of examples of this, of like many historical events from antiquity depicted as if they took place in the Dark Ages or the early Middle
Yeah.
Ages or the
Mm-hmm.
Middle Ages, right? And so historians have historically said that, well, that's just them. They're just stupid. Like everyone that came before us, it was just an idiot.
Yeah.
And so they depicted these people this way because they had no imagination, no creativity, and they assumed that everybody that came before them was dressed and had the same technology as they did. They didn't know what we know, that these people were more primitive. That and I don't know. Do you buy that explanation? What do you think of this? Is it possible that again we have something that happened at a different time? So we've talked about something
Yeah.
happening in a different location, possibly. Is it possible something happened at a different time and then this was then thrown into the past?
Well, yes. I mean, Before I talk about Julius Caesar, I think it's a very interesting case, very mysterious. But, you know, again, if you look at, if you watch the film Gladiator, at the beginning, you have this battle between the well-disciplined Romans, you know, with their full-bodied armor and helmet and so on, and the barbarians, you know, in skins of wild beast, you know. And if you think about it, it's like a chronological, how do you call it? Like you have two different epoch facing each other. Like
Stone Age versus
yeah, right, exactly. People coming from the Stone Age versus people from the Renaissance. There's something, if you think of it as a chronological paradox or a chronological anomaly, then you start to wonder, you know, how is it possible the Romans were like that, while the Romans just across the Rhine River had no idea of, you know, just doesn't make sense. And as you said, Julius Caesar's books, because he supposedly wrote many books. Today, many people believe that he wrote only one. You know, the Gallo, the wars. What's the name? Gallic wars of whatever wars. But he's supposed to have written many others, but you know, many people have concluded that they cannot have been written by him. The style is different and so on. But even the war in Gaul, in fact, raises very, very big problems to people who are studying today, archaeologists or historians who are still studying Gaul of the late first millennium BC, you know. And he's our only source on, you know, the mythology, religion, and it doesn't fit with what they find on the ground. So they start to think, well, Caesar didn't know what he was talking about. You know, obviously he never spoke to a guy from Gaul, because anthropologically, the mythology, the religion that he said the Gauls had, you know, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that it corresponds to what he says. So historians tend to think that he just made it up, or he borrowed it from an earlier, much earlier Greek historian called Cassiodorus, I think. You know, so everything, in other words, it's one case where everything he says right, he did not invent it, he borrowed it from an earlier sources, and everything that he is the only one to say doesn't make any sense. So there is a strong case to be made that his book was a Renaissance or Middle Age fraud. But how about Julius Caesar, the character himself? There's, I think, the best way to start to wonder is that the name itself of Julius Caesar has something very strange about it. Julius is basically means the sun or the sunlight, right? Jul, or in Indo-European language. Okay, so, well, why not? But Caesar, where did that name come from? So Caesar is his family name, supposedly, right? The problem is that
yeah, right.
The
Kaiser, Tsar, you know.
The problem is that there is another etymology which is also quite well attested, is that it's much more likely that it comes from the East. You know, the Greek form was Kaiser, and the Greek form also strangely became the German form.
So, Caesar, how real is Caesar really? And how much do we actually know about Caesar, if a lot of the sources that we have on Caesar are kind of dubious? We're not sure if it happened in Rome or not. And a lot of the accounts that Caesar himself gives are kind of strange. Like the battles that he describes are a little bit weird, hard to conceptualize, given the tactics used at the time. Where do we begin with Caesar and the strangeness of his name, which doesn't seem like the name of an actual person, kind of like the other the other famous JC in history, Jesus Christ, right? That's like two very similar cases, wouldn't you say? And someone has made the argument before that Jesus Christ is Julius Caesar. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe I don't know. Well, what do you make of it? How real is Caesar? That's my question to you.
Yeah, that's a crazy case. I mean, when you start to say, well, Julius Caesar is a fiction, then you you are beyond redemption, in the eyes of many people. But in fact, it's not new. If we start with the books supposedly written by Caesar, because he wrote a commentary, De Bello Gallico, the war in Gaul, but he wrote also other books, and these other books are today recognized by quite many people to be forgeries, or not to have been written by Caesar at least. And the Bello Gallico itself, there's been at least one scholar who argued that it cannot have been written by Julius Caesar. And then historians themselves, when they read the Bello Gallico, they are puzzled, because everything that Julius Caesar writes about the Gauls doesn't make much sense. The few things that make sense are borrowed directly from a Greek historian called Poseidonios. So obviously Julius Caesar, or whoever wrote the Bello Gallico, borrowed some information about the Gauls, not from a military campaign in Gaul itself, but from previous Greek historians. And then everything that he did not borrow from there doesn't make sense at all. Everything that Julius Caesar writes about the Gauls' religion, their mythology, their anthropology, their way of life, the tribes, the different tribes and their tribal life, and also all those kind of things. If you read today recent books about the Gauls, you will read that those historians are puzzled. It doesn't correspond to what they find in the ground. Nothing has been confirmed by archaeology. And so even the very existence of not only Julius Caesar, but Vercingetorix, who in French history, like, the hero of the Gaul, he supposedly federated all the tribes. He is mentioned only in that book, nowhere else. And his name actually means great warrior or something like this. So it's not even a real name. And so, I became puzzled. And then also I realized that, as you mentioned, the name of Julius Caesar is very strange, because I cannot get into too many details, but Julius itself is a word of mysterious origin, which means basically sun. Jul or Yule, is a word of Indo-European root, meaning the sun or the light of the sun. And Caesar seems to be a word coming also from Persia, maybe, meaning king. So Julius Caesar sounds like the Sun King, which makes sense if you think that Roman emperors believed they were adopted by the god king, so they were the son of the sun god somehow. And it just doesn't make much sense to think that Caesar was originally the name or the family name, the cognomen, the nickname of a person who was not even an emperor, because Julius Caesar was not really emperor, and that nickname was adopted to become synonym of emperor, and was adopted by all emperors and kings all over the world, even by the Russian Tsar, because supposedly Tsar come from Caesar. And also the German emperor became the Kaiser, and Kaiser strangely is Caesar, or Kaiser, but not borrowed from the Latin, but borrowed from the Greek form, Kaiser. And Kaiser in Byzantium was a royal title given to minor emperors, so the Basileus, the emperor, gave the title of it was kind of an honorific title. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Kaiser was a word coming from Greece, from Constantinople, maybe from Persia, because it may be related to Corso, or whatever, KRS, in Indo-European root. If you take away the vowels, you are left with KRS. And that's a root which seems to have meant king also in Persia. you know. So that's one case where you kind of smell, or you kind of feel that there's a perverted narrative to hide the truth that Roman traditions, the traditions of the Italian Romans, are actually coming from the East, from Greece, and maybe even from Persia, you know, and that Caesar, Caesar, whatever, is actually a name coming from the East, just like Rome itself. As I mentioned, Rome is a Greek word. Everybody agrees with that. Even the Romans agreed that Romos, which became Latinized as Remus and Romulus, is a Greek word meaning strong or strength, something like that. You know, so that's another case where you sense that in some way the story of Rome, including the story of Julius Caesar, which is so central to the whole story of Rome, was actually fabricated with material borrowed or stolen from the East. You know, and in my view, it's impossible to know exactly how much was stolen or borrowed and how much was based on real history. But in the case of Julius Caesar, you have really a case which, in my view, indicates a complete fabrication, complete fiction. Julius Caesar simply did not exist. He's a fictitious, which is incredible to think about, because we have statues of Julius Caesar, we have his whole life. You know, people can write books of 1,000 pages about his biography, telling where he came from, what year, what day he was born, where he grew up, what kind of man he was, what kind of personality he had, how he was murdered, and so on. You know, it becomes really crazy, but that's a possibility, strong possibility in my view.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that's sort of what most people I think would say is that wait, we have those statues and all these academics writing books about the guy, and in a way you could create a mathematical system, for example, where 2 + 2 = 5, and you built out an entire system based on that assumption, right? And then over time you'd start having problems in that system, and you'd have to figure out clever ways to work around the fact that you made an error at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But you could make a working system with 2 + 2 = 5. So the fact that there's complexity, the fact that a lot of people have written about it, they make the same argument about like church theology, but like look at all these fancy Latin and Greek words that we have, you know, describing, you know, theological type concepts, right? You know, look at all this stuff, this glitter, this pomp. Look at all these you know, academic speak, I guess, academic speak ahead of its time, theological speak. Look at all this fancy stuff. Isn't that proof enough? But if you ask like a lot of these core questions, like what do we really know? You know, where's the primary sources? What evidence do we have? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very scary picture. So in the beginning of the podcast, I brought up a couple of things. So you have a couple of what do you call it, like a possible things that can happen in history, which is duplication,
Mm-hmm.
when a story from the past is then replicated in the future, or a story or the opposite occurs, or you could have a case where the location is confused. Fomenko brings up the example of mercenaries from England, Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, who fought in the Roman Empire in the East, and when they came back home, they brought back the histories of their exploits. And then when these histories were found later, it was assumed that they were talking about stuff that happened to them while they were in England or in the area, when in
Mm-hmm.
reality it was from a far distant land. So that's an example of the
Yeah.
location getting mixed up. So perhaps the location of, and then finally we have just deliberate fabrication with a political agenda at mind, which we have verified. The church, the nation of Constantine, for example, perhaps Rome in the medieval times is trying to prove that it's better than its competitor in the East. So they invent this whole actually Rome started in Italy narrative, and actually, you know, Caesar was here type narrative. So yeah, there's a lot that can be said about this, but I think if we just look at the primary source evidence, there isn't any, which is a scary thought. So what do
Mm-hmm.
we have left if we don't look at, say, primary source evidence? We do have some swords, probably some armor that we found, some architecture, probably, ruins, and some frescoes and that sort of thing. Although even with that, it's dubious, because have you heard the story of Pompeii and the frescoes of Pompeii? Pompeii was supposed to have been destroyed by a volcano in BC, right? In ancient Rome. The only problem with that is that some of the stuff that's been unearthed, there's like pineapples, for example, depicted in the frescoes. We know for a fact from historical records of the late, from the 1600s and the 1500s, that there was a volcano that occurred at around that time. And so with Pompeii, it's one of those things that proves the existence of ancient Rome, but it is definitively 100% definitely something that happened in the Middle Ages and not in ancient Rome. And it's just such a clear-cut example of something being transposed, being cut out and moved to a different time period. And we know it because we can see what happened. We see it on the gravestones. It's not that far in the past. We can see how this process happened with the story of Pompeii. We can see gravestones, for example, in the area that talk about this volcano going off. We can see memorials to it. We can see maps that have the lost city of Pompeii on the map in medieval times, and then them disappearing, and then it being discovered later. And then they say, oh, we actually found an ancient Roman city. No, it's and we have artwork there depicting things from the New World, which couldn't be there. And yet still historical orthodoxy says that this event occurred in this ancient Roman period, even though it simply doesn't work. It just simply doesn't fit. And it's just the perfect example of how it sounds crazy, but it's not as crazy as it sounds, because we know that it happened at least in this one case, right? So where does that leave us? Like, well, I guess we can only understand the last 1,000 years barely. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's why I would not agree with, I would not follow Fomenko's radical revisionism, because I think, as I try to find out from what time do we have some kind of secure history, I feel that the whole second millennium AD is somehow reasonably secure, at least the chronology of the political history, the Crusades, and all that, because from that time we do have, at least from the 12th century, we do have quite a lot of original manuscripts, and using AD dating system, Anno Domini. So from that time on, I think the chronology is quite solid. That's why I do not agree. There are not only Fomenko, but there are a lot of people in France, also people who want to challenge the chronology up to the 17th century. People who go and say, for example, the Egyptian pyramids were built by Napoleon when he went to Egypt, and this kind of thing. So I draw a clear line. I say stop. For me, the second millennium AD is reasonably secure. The chronology is reasonably secure, not, of course, the whole history. I mentioned the Crusades in the beginning. The whole history of the Crusades is a farce. Our Western view of the Crusades is a farce. That's why our whole narrative about our own European and French history in particular is seriously flawed, and that's a serious problem. But the whole first millennium is still full of mysteries, impossibilities, contradictions. And unfortunately, I was hoping to try to be able to forge a reasonable alternative narrative, or alternative chronology. But it seems impossible. But as you mentioned, there are definitely duplicates. There are definitely also another thing that Fomenko proposed, is that some histories sometimes were written by different people coming from with using different language, different names, different perspectives on the same events. And when those two stories were when chronologists tried to fit those stories, they did not recognize that they refer to the same event, so they put them, one on top of the other. And there's all kind of phenomena like this, which and Fomenko did do a great. Fomenko and his team, Nozovsky, I forgot the name of his assistant, but anyway, he had a whole team. Yeah, he did a lot of very interesting. He was a pioneer. I think he died recently, no, didn't he? I don't think he's alive.
Did
still.
he? Oh no, I really wanted to meet the guy.
I'm not sure. I think I don't think he's.
I had a friend, and we were together in Russia, and we were like, we got to go down and we got to meet this guy.
Oh yeah.
And then COVID and everything. So.
Yeah.
But that's unfortunate. I hope that's not true. If it is, then that's very unfortunate. He really was a pioneer, and he also added, just to say a little bit more about his work, he came up with a bunch of methods that used mathematics pretty much. And so, for example, we know in the story of Christ's crucifixion that there was a solar eclipse. So of course, Fomenko, I don't know if he's the first person in history to do it, but I would assume not. But he basically calculated, is it possible that there was a solar eclipse in Jerusalem at this time? And the answer, of course, was no, there wasn't. No one was crucified, and there was no, unless, of course, the movement of the heavenly bodies was completely altered and then returned back to normal, as if nothing had occurred.
No,
well,
sorry,
anyway,
he's not dead. I just checked now. No, he's 78 years old. I don't know why I thought he was dead.
Good. There's still a chance. There's still a chance
exactly.
I can meet him.
Yeah. Yeah,
But,
you mentioned astrology, astronomy, and so on, and also the comet events and so on. This is always something that people bring up and say, well, we know, the chronology can be checked, can be verified based on all these astronomical events. But Fomenko and others have shown that, well, when you check seriously all those astronomical events, it does not confirm the chronology. Rather, it destroys it. It depends how if you really want astronomical events to confirm the chronology, then you fold the data into your preconceived chronology, and somehow you come up with some argument saying, well, it does confirm it, but the reality is not like that. So
he concluded that Jesus Christ had to have been crucified in like 1024.
Yeah, but he identified him with, I think, a Byzantine emperor called Andronicus, I think, who was torn apart by the people of Constantinople. I don't find this convincing at all.
No, I don't find it either. But I can see why, if you kept some elements of the orthodoxy, but like if you didn't completely re-examine everything that you think that you know, and you tried to,
But there is a point to be made that Julius lived much closer to the Middle Age, to the 10th or 11th century. Even if you think about the Crusades, it's very, very interesting that the Crusaders went to Jerusalem, under the cry, the war cry, let's avenge Jesus, as if they were going there to avenge some guy who was murdered just a few years before. So there's many reasons to
not 1200 years. Yeah, exactly. And with the rise of Islam, you wrote about this as well. That's a weird thing as well, it seems. So now I don't so you subscribe more to the minus, let's subtract 300 years theory, right?
Well, I was subscribed to Gunnar Heinsohn's 700 years, but then recently I came to not be so sure. I really like Gunnar Heinsohn because he based his whole work. He died a few months ago, actually, and in that case, that's not the information is correct. But he did base his whole work on archaeological evidence, stratigraphy. That means the study of precise location of archaeological finds, and he shows, that there are missing strata in archaeology everywhere. And so the chronology, if the strata is the clearest hard evidence for chronology, then he comes up with 700. And he has very strong evidence. And in the case of Islam, Arabia, in fact, that's one of his strongest case. The history of Arabia is full of holes. It just doesn't add up. There is a huge hole between Roman Arabia, the Arabia of Emperor Adrian, and the Arabia of the Prophet Muhammad. In between, it's like a whole gap, and duplicates between those two periods, and so on. So that's a strong. That's another.
Yeah. So if we basically cut things down by, let's say, 300 or 700 years, what we have is there's no big gap between this medieval period and the late Roman period.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't this strange. All these religions, Abrahamic, Christianity and Islam, are actually very similar, it turns out. And it turns out that Islam was, from what I understand, it was just a Christian sect, right? Where so Christianity and Islam are both just Jewish heresies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they were all fighting over Jerusalem. And so when Islam takes Jerusalem, it's actually just a Jewish heresy or a Christian heresy, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, if you cut the timeline, the response, it doesn't take the Christians 1,000 years to respond to this aggression, right? They respond like within the next 100 years, right? That makes a lot more sense. So a lot of these things that don't make a lot of sense, like the Crusades were a response to Islam expanding and taking over Jerusalem. Does that really make sense? If it happened 1,200 years after the death of Christ, and 600 years after all, if not more, after all these lands were taken, Yeah. So you simply remove these years, and all of a sudden things are happening much more dynamically. There's a much easier chain of logic of cause and effect, and the reaction to a lot of these big events. And the only thing you need to really get rid of is this period of darkness where all the information was lost, all records were lost, all technology was lost. You just don't need it. If you can erase that from your conception of the world, and you see a kind of continuity, then I guess the question is, who benefited by creating the Dark Ages? And I know you provided some answers as well. But is it just a pious religious fraud to create, to I don't know, like what, to fill up the history books with lives of fake saints? Is it to increase the prestige of the Catholic Church, to say that we actually had 1,000 years that didn't exist, of reign? Why do you think this falsification was created?
Well, I don't think the falsification was voluntarily chronological. I mean, a lot of things were invented. Always the most important case in point is the donation of Constantine. So a lot of historical fraud were made, a lot of forgeries were made for different reasons. And then at some point, some people started to build a chronology, and using all these fraudulent sources, they came up with a chronology too long, much too long. But I don't think it was, somebody decided to add up a few centuries for some reason. I think it's in order to fit all these forgeries, all these falsified history, these fictitious characters, and in order to fit them in a sequence, they had to come up with a longer chronology than the reality. That's the way I would tend to see it, because I cannot, when I look at the early chronologists of the 11th or 12th century, I do not see them as as conscious falsifiers or conscious being involved in conscious fraud. That's my problem. I think they just try to make sense of all their sources without realizing that many of these sources were fake, fake history. That's rather how I see it.
Right,
For example,
but the original,
yeah.
Sorry, but the original fakers, I mean, they had an
Yeah.
agenda, obviously.
Yeah, sure,
And then
sure.
the
But they were not so much concerned by chronology, in terms of mathematical, they were not building up a chronology. They were inventing, and they were, yes, projecting in a far away past things which were more recent, yes, but without too much, without too much precision in their dating. They were just pushing things back into antiquity. They were pushing Rome as far back as they could in order to say, well, look, Rome existed long before Constantinople. And then because of that, because they knew that their Roman culture was Greek, then they also had to push back the ancient Greeks, even further back. These kind of things, I believe. But they were not putting clear dates on it. The dates came later. That's how I see it, but I'm not sure.
Fair enough. I know I have a lot more questions to ask, but I've definitely used up a lot of your time, and we've definitely, I think, given an interesting, what do you call it, a primer text, something that might pique someone's interest and get them interested in reading more. If we talk about this topic again, and I hope that we do, I wanted to shift our focus even more east and ask you your opinion on the Hungarian chronicles, on the the Slavic chronicles, the Letopisye, and about some of the theories about Peter the Great falsifying Russian history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a very fun topic, and there's different cultures have. Again, I think that the people who wrote these histories focused on a very slim selection of historical texts to make it work. The funny thing is that if you take the traditions of different countries, that it just doesn't fit. Like the Hungarian accounts are wild. Like they totally change our understanding of everything that was happening if they're true.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, only Hungarians take them seriously right now. But and then where does the Slavic stories come into this? Where does the Saint Peter's, Peter the Great and his historical revisionism, where does that, this lost country of Tartaria, maybe we can get into that next time. But I don't know, do you have any concluding thoughts? And then then we'll sign off.
Well, no, just to conclude maybe on Peter the Great and so on. At least one thing is whatever Peter the Great did, he did not invent the first millennium of Russian history, because Russian history, as you mentioned at the beginning, basically starts in the 10th century. That's why, to some extent, that's why Russian history is pretty much real, at least much more real than European history, because it starts at a time when chronicles can be trusted to some extent. So sure, he must have invented a lot of things, but there are still so many mysteries, and it's fascinating. Unfortunately, we have to be humble and accept that we cannot solve all these enigmas about the Huns, the Slavs. There's definitely a lot also about the Goth. The Aryan Goths. There's something which also doesn't add up, but I cannot figure out where. And the level to which history has been falsified, especially by Christianity, especially in the early centuries of Christianity, is so deep that it's really almost impossible, I think, to solve some of these enigmas. But it's fascinating, and as I said, I think it's useful because a lot of revisionism in itself is also important to understand who we are as nations, European nations, and how we, because a nation can invent its own story, and teach it to the schoolboys, but that doesn't make it real. And maybe we can think, well, it doesn't matter, because if we teach it to all the schoolboys, it becomes real. But my view is that there is a deeper karmic law that is more important. What happened leaves traces and determines the destiny of a nation. Not only how the nation tells its own stories, but what really happened has importance. And it's important to find out. This is my view. And this, against this view, I understand those who say, well, it doesn't matter if it happened. What's important is that we build up the sense of patriotism by teaching the kids, all the great things that our nations did. But, in the case of America, at least we can see it doesn't really work. Sooner or later, all the crimes, committed come up. You cannot just help it. You cannot just blame it on, Black Americans. Oh, it's unfair to bring up slavery all the time, and American Indians to keep complaining. Why don't they shut up? It doesn't work like this. We have to. Revisionism is the essence of history. That's all. You cannot do history without being a revisionist. What's the purpose?
Well, what's funny is that we get critiqued, or at least I get a lot of critique from people who actually don't love history as much as I do, which is funny because I was the kid who was listening to all this stuff and I was so eager to learn and like, yes, I believe it, and it hurts actually to learn. All this stuff about the Greeks, like how much of our history about the Greeks is true? Did it even take place in Greece? Is it possible that the tales of Homer are actually from like Scandinavia or the Baltics or England or something? And that they got, because Plato says it's a foreign tale. So how much of the what if it's not that ancient? What if this was happening only like 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago? That kind of hurts a little bit, because in my mind it's bathed in this like this mystical from the dawn beyond the dawn of time. It's magical to me. But I don't care. I can still take a look at it.
Anyway, all these architecture, for example, in Rome, doesn't matter so much if it's 1,000 years old, younger than we think. It's still there, it's still beautiful. Homer's writing is still great. If you really think about it, what difference does it make if it's 2,000 years old or 1,000 years old?
Well, I just can't believe that all these people were convinced, basically by Italian propaganda, that the Germans were convinced, all the northern peoples, and were convinced, and partially the French as well, that they were a bunch of savages that had to be civilized, and then the Slavic peoples were convinced that they didn't exist, and that when they did, they were slaves or something. It's like, why are we believing this? If you're talking about patriotism, how can you, as a German or a French or a Slav, how can you accept this like weird, papal-centric narrative? It's like, come on, think about it.
Right? There's definitely. Unfortunately, I cannot really find my way into the controversy about the Slavs or the origin of the Slavs. But under my articles on the Unz Review, I get a lot of comments, especially by one commenter who calls himself Odyssey, and he's really into it, and it's really fascinating. There is definitely something about the origin, the history of the Slavs being distorted or even erased, and their historical role much greater than what they themselves believe today. That's I'm quite convinced of it, but I haven't studied it deeply enough. But that's another great fascinating field.
Well, last question, and I'll leave it on this for sure. Okay. I promise.
Great.
Because we're running out of time anyway. But I mean, imagine then, like, if we say that history is, the timeline is shortened by about 700 years, already that's crazy. But what if, I'm already at the point where I believe that I don't think that the human civilization is only 6,000 years old, or how, Ur and Uruk are the first places. And then I don't believe any of that. I believe that I don't believe that the Germans were these savages running around in the woods when they meet with the Romans.
Yeah.
I think that they had civilization. I think that there was all of Europe had civilization. I think they had metallurgy, you know, and so there's this entire. It's not even what I'm saying is that we have to consider the possibility that it's not that we have a lost millennium. It's actually everything that came even before that millennium. You know, that's
Mm,
it's not just like there could be tens of thousands of years of missing history and not like empty forests with nobody in it, but like
yeah.
actual empty history. That's the incredible thing.
Yeah, it's true, and we haven't talked about, but we have to take into account the, cosmic catastrophes that
Yeah,
erased the whole civilization. And there actually an interesting theory today that Atlantis is actually Western Europe. There was a Western European civilization that became that was completely wiped out by a cosmic catastrophe. But yeah, that's definitely a probability, yeah, something, yeah. Okay,
well, we'll have to leave it until next time then, but
yeah,
this was quite the talk. You know, I'm sure. I don't know why, but a lot of people get really provoked by this topic. That hey, you know, we may not know everything about history, and with the catastrophes, I think the catastrophes explain the rise of this millenniary. What do you call it? Apocalyptic type religions like
hmm,
Christianity, Islam, and
definitely,
Judaism,
yeah, definitely,
where they it's and every and the thing that gives these religions so much power is that they can always turn to say Revelation or to some of the prophecies in the Old Testament, and they
yeah,
can always
exactly,
say the world is horrible, everything is bad. It said it would be this way in this book, so that's
yeah.
just proof, you know.
Jesus told you so. So that's there was a major argument from the early Christian missionaries. Look, really, Jesus told you about these catastrophes. So
Right.
yeah,
And so that's an interesting thing is that these catastrophes have not only wiped out past civilizations, possibly ended the ancient world and transitioned us into Christendom and then modernity, but you know, I think they may have also left a mark on people psychologically, and that's why religion shifted as well. That's why our
yeah,
thinking shifted as well. But that's
sure,
also covered up the whole idea that there could be cosmic catastrophes, there could be collapses, not once every million years, but
mm.
more often than that, that's totally covered up.
Yeah, it is.
I think I know why. So that's in a whole other topic. Maybe for
Yeah,
next time.
yeah, yeah.
All
That's the
right,
whole topic.
Laurent,
Yeah. Okay. Well,
thank you
thank you
so
very much
much.
for. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. We have to talk again. These are I really look forward to these. So until
Well, I
next time.
enjoyed it too. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and God bless.